Good day one and all. Welcome to the 9th lecture for Module 1 of the course IE306 Supply Chain and Logistics Management. In this lecture, we would have a look at the last step towards achieving strategic fit, that is step number 3, achieving strategic fit, where we either modify the competitive strategy or the supply chain strategy to achieve this particular fit. I am Matthew Beebe, Assistant Professor with the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. So without further delay, let's get started with the lecture. So the last step towards achieving strategic fit is basically understanding the extent of differences between a company's competitive strategy and its supply chain strategy. As in step number 2, we should make sure, as the basic objective of any strategic fit, achieving strategic fit, is to align the company's competitive strategy with other functional strategy, specifically the supply chain strategy. So if there is any kind of misalignment between these two strategies, that particular misalignment has to be corrected, and that is what is done in step number 3. So based upon the implied uncertainty faced by a supply chain or a firm, or the location of a firm in the implied uncertainty spectrum, which we have defined in step number 1, and based upon the position of the supply chain in the responsiveness spectrum, which was determined by step number 2 of achieving strategic fit, it is required to ensure that there is a degree of supply chain, that the degree of supply chain responsiveness is consistent with the level of implied uncertainty. That is, for a firm that faces high implied uncertainty or has a location on the implied uncertainty spectrum nearer to the high implied uncertainty region, the supply chain strategy should be such that the supply chain is made to be highly responsive. So on the responsiveness spectrum of where the supply chain is positioned on the responsiveness spectrum, it should be positioned towards the side where the supply chain is highly responsive. So for high implied uncertainty conditions faced by a firm, the supply chain should be tailored or should be designed in such a fashion that it is made highly responsive. And in the other opposite case, where a firm faces low implied uncertainty, the supply chain should focus upon being efficient. And for cases in between, the supply chain should be tailored to be sufficiently responsive at reasonable or acceptable levels of efficiency. So take for example the case of high implied uncertainty. McMaster Car is basically a maintenance, repair and overhaul company, which basically focuses upon delivering wide or large variety of products within a very short amount of time to its customers. So since the company focuses, its competitive strategy is basically focused upon delivering a larger variety in a very short time, the company faces very high levels of implied uncertainty. So the characteristics of demand of the customers on whom McMaster Car focuses upon, it is a set of characteristics that is similar to the ones where we see high implied uncertainty. So the McMaster Cars focus upon delivering a large variety of products within a very short time will result in the company facing high levels of implied uncertainty. So to face this particular high level of implied uncertainty, the company has to make, or the firm has to make this particular its supply chain highly responsive, and this is carried out by carrying high levels of inventory of a large variety and using the fastest possible delivery modes. So they make their supply chain responsive. Since the company as a whole is facing a high implied uncertainty condition, they are forced to make their supply chain responsive so that there is strategic fit. And in achieving this particular strategic fit, they do this by carrying high levels of inventory of a larger variety of products and also using a fast mode of delivery. Whereas, for example, take the case of a firm that faces low implied uncertainty, Barilla, it's a firm that makes pasta. Okay, so the demand for pasta is generally very steady. Okay, and what customers require is good quality pasta at the lowest possible prices. So the demand nature of demand, or the attributes of demand, are similar to the attributes which are seen in the case of low implied uncertainty. So therefore, Barilla, a pasta maker, is a firm that will face low implied uncertainty, and hence such kinds of firms should focus their efforts upon tailoring the supply chain towards being more efficient or keeping the cost as low as possible. Okay, if the pasta maker Barilla had made their supply chain highly responsive by waiting for customer orders, okay, then manufacturing it and then delivering it, okay, rather than focusing upon being efficient, the cost involved in manufacturing would be so high that it would be prohibitive for customers to make a purchase. It will basically deter customers from making purchases due to the extremely high prices. So rather than making to order, Barilla basically makes to stock. Okay, it's a made to stock kind of production where they estimate or forecast demand for customers, make them in large quantities so that the manufacturing process is economical, and hence they can keep their cost down. Okay, so in achieving strategic fit, what is important is for a firm to move to a region called as zone of strategic fit. So to understand the zone of strategic fit, let us take into account or take into consideration this particular graph. Okay, on the x-axis we have the level of implied uncertainty that is faced by the firm. Okay, and on the y-axis we have the level of responsiveness that the firm's supply chain currently has. So the responsiveness spectrum, the position of the firm on the responsiveness spectrum, and the position of the firm under consideration on the implied uncertainty spectrum, okay, they are marked along the y and x axis respectively. So what we do is we basically locate that particular firm on this particular zone of this particular graph. Okay, say for example, a firm is a firm that faces high levels of uncertain demand, therefore the implied uncertainty is very high. That means it's towards the rightmost end on the x-axis. Okay, so this is a region of low implied uncertainty where the demand is generally certain or much more predictable. When we move towards the right along the x-axis, we see that the demand is becoming uncertain, so the implied uncertainty will be high. Okay, similarly on the y-axis, as we move upwards, the supply chain is more responsive, and as we move downwards from the center, the supply chain is highly efficient. So near the origin, the supply chain is tailored to be at the highest possible efficiency. Say for example, a current firm, okay, it's a firm that faces very high levels of implied uncertainty. Okay, so let us mark the position along the x-axis here. Okay, and the current supply chain is at a very low level of responsiveness. The supply chain is made such that it is say somewhat responsive and somewhat efficient. Okay, so somewhere in the middle. So the position of this particular firm on this particular graph would be somewhere around here. Okay, so let me mark that particular position here, right here. Okay, let us mark it here. So what we have to do is we have this particular firm which faces high implied uncertainty. So it is ideal for that particular firm to be designed to be highly responsive. But currently it is somewhat responsive and somewhat efficient. So we have to move this particular firm to a location where the supply chain strategy is in alignment with the level of implied uncertainty faced by the firm. So based upon the level of uncertainty faced by the firm, the supply chain strategy should be such that the supply chain is tailored to be much more responsive. So for increasing implied uncertainty, we see that the supply chain, okay, has to be made more and more responsive by trading of efficiency. So there is a basic range in which we achieve strategic fit, and that particular combination of implied uncertainty and responsiveness where strategic fit is achieved is called as zone of strategic fit. This particular area that is currently highlighted in gray. Okay, so the combinations of implied uncertainty faced by a company and the responsiveness where we see that strategic fit is achieved, that particular zone is referred to as zone of strategic fit. So here currently the firm is not operating in the zone of strategic fit. So the firm has to remodel, either change its competitive strategies so that it faces lower levels of implied uncertainty. Okay, so when I change my competitive strategy and move towards a set of a market segment where the implied uncertainty is smaller, I am moving horizontally back along this particular x-axis. So I am moving parallel, and when I bring it to a certain level, I see that I am operating in the zone of strategic fit. Okay, where the supply chain strategy, okay, and the level of implied uncertainty spectrum based upon the competitive strategy are matching. Okay, the other option for this particular firm to achieve strategic fit is by modifying its supply chain strategy itself. Okay, rather than focusing upon being moderately responsive and moderately efficient, it can move it upwards. Okay, where it can raise the responsiveness of the supply chain and move into the zone of strategic fit. Okay, so it can move vertically. At the same time, it can move also diagonally like this. Okay, so it can trade off implied uncertainty and responsiveness and move into a zone of strategic fit. Okay, so there are two steps in moving towards or in achieving strategic fit. That is what we will be talking about in the next slide. So in achieving strategic fit or a high level of performance for a company, okay, there are two steps involved. First is to move towards the zone of strategic fit, or move the entire company towards the zone of strategic fit, either by modifying the competitive strategy or the supply chain strategy, or both. The competitive strategy will determine the level of implied uncertainty that is faced by the company, and the company's supply chain strategy will determine the level of responsiveness that a firm has. Okay, so it's based upon how you move towards the zone of strategic fit. The company can do that by either modifying its competitive strategy alone, or modifying its supply chain strategy alone, or modifying both of them together so that the company moves towards zone of strategic fit, as I have explained in the previous slide. So once the company has moved towards zone of strategic fit, it is very clear that what levels of supply chain responsiveness has to be achieved. Okay, or what changes does a supply chain has to make in terms of its responsiveness. So once the level of responsiveness is determined, then the next step, that is step B in achieving strategic fit, is basically assigning roles to different stages of the supply chain so that the appropriate level of responsiveness for the entire supply chain is achieved. Okay, so different stages of a supply chain may be assigned different levels of responsiveness and efficiency so as to attain the desired supply chain responsiveness for the entire supply chain. Okay, so to understand step B in more detail, we would take the case, or we'll take the help of examples. Okay, so we'll move on to the coming slides, and then we'll understand how we can allocate different levels of responsiveness for different supply chain stages so that the required or appropriate level of responsiveness for the entire supply chain is achieved. Okay, so take for example one approach used by a company called Ikea, okay, in achieving a certain level of supply chain responsiveness. So in the case of Ikea, which is basically a Swedish furniture manufacturer and retailer, they sell their furniture through their own stores. So what they do is they target customers who require stylish products at reasonable cost. So the target customers of Ikea requires stylish products but at reasonable cost. Okay, so what it does in order to limit its cost or keep cost within reasonable limits, is basically it limits its variety of styles that it sells. Okay, and its stores are generally very large. So since its stores are large and they only stock limited variety, or when they only sell limited variety of styles of furniture, the company Ikea is basically facing a situation of demand, or basically facing attributes of demand that are synonymous with a condition of low implied uncertainty. So as a whole, Ikea, due to its decision to limit the variety and to use very large stores where it stocks large amounts of inventory, okay, the implied uncertainty faced by the supply chain is very low. Okay, so the customers, they are served from the very large inventories of all the styles of products which are stocked in very large quantities in a particular store. So every store maintains all styles, okay, in very large quantities. So the IKEA stores, if you have seen them, you see that they are very large in terms of their physical size. They hold large amounts of inventories of all varieties. So that is how they ensure the required level of responsiveness. So since they are a company that faces low levels of uncertainty, this particular company has to be tailored, or the supply chain strategy has to be tailored to be more efficient. Okay, and in order to have this particular low level of responsiveness and high level of efficiency, the level of responsiveness required is basically done by the inventory that is held by the retail stores. So the retail stores, they hold the items in large amounts of inventory. Okay, and this inventory is what basically absorbs all the uncertainty faced by the supply chain and makes it responsive enough. Okay, so any uncertainty or any fluctuations in demand is basically absorbed by the retail store itself, because the retail store can do so since it's keeping all the styles of furniture in large quantities. Okay, moreover, they also rely upon a concept of design called modularity. Okay, where you can pick and choose different parts and combine them to make customized furnitures. So the furniture assembly is done only at the customer end. Okay, all the furnitures, they come into the store as parts, okay, which can be assembled as per customer requirements. They can pick and choose within a limited variety. So this basically helps them to store these large amounts of inventory at very low cost. Okay, and this large amounts of inventory basically helps to absorb any kind of uncertainty faced by the supply chain in terms of demand, and thus making it responsive enough. So thus the replenishment orders that are placed on the manufacturers, okay, the retailers are supplied by the manufacturers themselves. So the replenishment orders are much more stable and regular, and thus it transfers very little uncertainty to the manufacturers. So in the entire supply chain of IKEA, the required level of responsiveness is basically taken in its entirety by the retail store itself. Okay, all the uncertainty that is faced, that is taken up by the retail store itself with its large amounts of inventory, and the orders, replenishment orders from the retail stores are much more regular. So the manufacturer can hold, or manufacturer can maintain a steady production rate. So thus the uncertainty transferred to the manufacturer is less, and hence manufacturers can focus upon being more efficient, and hence they are generally situated in countries where the cost of manufacturing is very low. Okay, for the manufacturers, they only absorb very low, they generally do not absorb any kind of uncertainty, okay, or very little uncertainty is transferred to them. So hence they can focus upon being more efficient, and the retailers are the ones who are basically focusing upon being responsive. So IKEA, it achieves a strategic fit between its competitive strategy and its supply chain strategy by making the retailers responsive and transferring very low amounts of uncertainty to its manufacturers, thus allowing them to focus upon being efficient. So hence they are able to serve the customers with required level of responsiveness, and they are also able to keep their costs low. Okay, so we'll look at another example of how to achieve the required level of responsiveness. Okay, that is, we'll talk about another approach called approach 2 used by another company. So for the same step, that is step B, we have another company, another furniture manufacturer who uses an entirely different approach. So Inkland Incorporated is basically a furniture manufacturer based in the US, and their competitive strategy is quite different from Ikea. Okay, Ikea targeted customers with low variety, stylish furniture requirements at reasonable cost. Here, they are talking about customers, or they're targeting customers who want custom furniture, but where they want it relatively quick delivery as well. Okay, so this is not a made to stock kind of manufacturing system. They want customers to customers generally want customized furnitures, so you cannot make them previously and store them. You have to wait for the customer order and then manufacture. That's why it's called as a made to order system. And since it's a made to order system and we have to wait for the customer to place an order, and since they want this delivery very quickly done, okay, the level of implied uncertainty faced by this particular supply chain, the supply chain that delivers custom furniture, okay, to customers at reasonably low times, the entire supply chain as a whole will face large amounts of uncertainty. Okay, so the implied uncertainty level will be very high. So that is completely different from what we see in the case of IKEA. Okay, so since the high level of implied uncertainty, since the company faces high level of implied uncertainty, to achieve strategic fit, okay, we have to move the company to a zone of strategic fit, and that requires the company to make its supply chain highly responsive. Okay, so the required responsiveness, that is very high levels of responsiveness, may be achieved by the retailer by holding lower levels of inventory, and thus the retailer as a whole does not absorb a large part of uncertainty. Okay, the entire supply chains, the last part, okay, the link between the manufacturer and the customer, that is the retailer, they absorb very low levels of uncertainty. Okay, that is because they only hold very low levels of inventory, just say 1 or 2 pieces, just to show customers how the particular product will look like. Okay, and based upon custom orders, the retailer basically transfers these orders to the manufacturers. So the required level of responsiveness here is achieved by the retailer holding low levels of inventory, thus absorbing low levels of uncertainty, and the retailer basically focuses upon being efficient. Okay, so the responsiveness level required here is very high, but the retailer does not contribute towards responsiveness. Okay, they only maintain low levels of inventory and they focus upon efficiency. Most of the implied uncertainty, okay, and the resulting requirement for responsiveness is passed on to the manufacturer, who now has to be flexible and should have very low response times. So the major burden of being responsive, okay, it falls upon the manufacturer. They have to make their manufacturing facility flexible so that they can manufacture these custom order furnitures for their target customers and then deliver it at the lowest possible times. So they have to manufacture custom products and they have to do it very quickly. So most of the implied uncertainty is basically absorbed by the manufacturer, and this particular absorption of large amount of implied uncertainty basically forces the manufacturer to make their facility flexible, and thus the manufacturer has to focus upon being responsive. Okay, and the manufacturer itself may pass a part of its uncertainty to its suppliers if it decides that it only keeps a low amount of inventory of raw materials and other parts. So if the manufacturer stocks all kind of raw materials and all kinds of other parts required for the furniture manufacturer in large amounts, then the supplier will have steady orders. Therefore, the uncertainty that is passed on to suppliers will also be less. But if the manufacturer can't take up that particular burden of being highly responsive, it can transfer its load or certain part of its uncertainty to suppliers by only maintaining low amounts of inventory. Okay, and wanting the suppliers to be responsive by asking them to deliver their products, that is parts as well as raw materials, at short notice to the manufacturers. Okay, so to understand this better, we'll look at a graphical diagram that is given in the next, a graphical or a schematic representation of two firms that face the same level of input uncertainty. Now, in this example for England Incorporated and Ikea, we are talking about two different companies that face two levels or two different levels of input uncertainty. Okay, now we'll have a look at two different firms that faces the exact same amount of implied uncertainty but achieve the required level of responsiveness by dividing that particular responsiveness requirement across different stages. Okay, so take an example here. Okay, we have supply chain 1 for a firm that deals with some product X and supply chain 2 for a firm that deals with some product Y. Okay, so the level of implied uncertainty faced by these two supply chain 1 and 2 is the same. So the extent of implied uncertainty is given by this particular box. The length of this particular box basically shows the level of implied uncertainty faced by both the supply chains 1 and 2. Okay, and both of these supply chains is basically a three-stage supply chain where we have the supplier, manufacturer and the retailer, and here also we have supplier, manufacturer and the retailer. Okay, rather it's not a three-stage supply chain, it's a four-stage supply chain, the fourth stage being the customer. So we have taken out the customer, okay, because customers are not part of the supply chain when we consider making the supply chain responsive or efficient. Okay, they are the end link towards a supply chain. So hence if we consider this particular three-stage supply chain or rather a four-stage supply chain where the customer is completely omitted. Okay, so we have supply chain 1 and supply chain 2. Now in supply chain 1 we see a case where the retailer absorbs a large proportion of the implied uncertainty faced by the supply chain. Okay, so this is the case that we see similar to Ikea. The retailer absorbing very large amounts of uncertainty. Okay, and thus the retailer has to be highly responsive. Okay, and the manufacturer absorbs comparatively lower levels of uncertainty, so thus they can be somewhat efficient. They must be focused upon efficiency. And the supplier absorbs the least implied uncertainty and thus they must be focused upon being very efficient. So the entire extent of implied uncertainty faced by the supply chain is achieved by making one of the stages, that is the retailer stage, highly responsive, the manufacturer stage be somewhat efficient, and the supply chain being very efficient, supply stage being very efficient. That is with the case of supply chain 1. And in supply chain 2 we see another different scenario as well. Okay, here the retailer absorbs very little implied uncertainty and thus they should focus upon being very efficient. The manufacturer absorbs the most of the implied uncertainty and thus they must be responsive. And here the supplier might be transferred some part of the uncertainty faced by the manufacturer and hence they should be focused upon being somewhat efficient and somewhat responsive. So this particular supply chain 2 is similar to the case that you see in the furniture manufacturer England Incorporated. Okay, so the entire extent of implied uncertainty of supply chain is achieved by distributing different levels of efficiency and responsiveness requirements for different stages. This is what we do in step number 2 called deciding roles and allocating the roles, that is roles and allocations. That is step B in achieving strategic fit. So step A is basically moving a company or a firm towards zone of strategic fit either by modifying the company's competitive strategy or its supply chain strategy or both. Okay, and once we have moved to the zone of strategic fit, then it's all about modifying the supply chain. Okay, so we allocate different roles and different levels of responsiveness and efficiency requirements to different stages so that we get a supply chain of the required levels of responsiveness. Okay, so these are the steps involved in achieving strategic fit. So this is the last step, that is step number 3, that is achieving strategic fit. Now, for a company to achieve strategic fit in its entirety, it is not only required that the supply chain strategy be in alignment with a company's competitive strategy. All other functional strategies, Okay, in a company or in a firm, there are lots of other functions which have to be performed for a supply chain to deliver a product, or for a company to deliver a product or service to its customers. So all the functional strategies, okay, including the supply chain strategy, should be in alignment with the company's competitive strategy to achieve strategic fit in its entirety. So we'll have a look at what the functional strategies would look like for an efficient supply chain that is tailored to be efficient, and for a supply chain that is tailored to be more responsive. Okay, so we'll see differences in functional strategies here. We'll basically compare the different functional strategies for an efficient versus responsive supply chain. So for an efficient supply chain, the primary goal is to supply the demand at the lowest possible cost. For a responsive supply chain, it's basically to respond as quickly to the demand as possible. So cost is not a concern here. Okay, so it is not a concern in the sense that cost is not a primary concern. Here, in the case of an efficient supply chain, the primary concern is to supply the demand at the lowest possible cost. So this is not a functional strategy, but rather just stating out what the primary goals of these different supply chains are. Okay, so when you talk about the functional strategy called new product, okay, new product development, their product design strategy for an efficient supply chain will focus upon maximum performance of the product at the lowest possible cost. Whereas when we design a product for a supply chain that has to be responsive, what has to be done is the product has to be designed with modularity in mind. Okay, so when we create modularity, that will allow the product differentiation to take place at a later stage. So it allows for post-mortem of product differentiation, where we can ship uh, the products in parts, okay, and the product will only take its final form when it reaches the customer, but where the customer has to put together different parts and form the required product. So that basically helps with high levels of responsiveness. So when the product design strategy, as far as product design strategy is concerned, for efficient supply chains, the focus should be upon designs that will help them manufacture the product at the lowest possible cost. Whereas if you're designing a product for a supply chain which is tailored to be responsive, or the customer requires a responsiveness or prioritizes responsiveness, then the product should be designed with modularity in mind, which will allow for post-mortem of product differentiation. Okay. Similarly, the pricing strategies are also different. In the case of an efficient supply chain, customers, they prioritize cost. So the pricing should always be such that the margins are kept minimum. Okay. So the cost of production, the selling price will be very near quantities. Okay. And as far as responsive supply chains are concerned, what customers require is fast response. So they are even willing to pay a slightly larger amount or a premium, okay, for getting the required parts or required products at the required time. So higher margins is generally practiced in responsive supply chains. Then for manufacturing strategy, the manufacturing should focus upon keeping low costs in efficient supply chains, whereas for responsive supply chain, they should focus upon having flexibility in capacity to provide any buffer against any demand or supply uncertainty. Okay, there might be uncertainty in demand and uncertainty in supply of raw materials by the suppliers. So to keep this particular to buffer against this particular uncertainty, there should be flexibility in capacity. Okay, so they have to maintain larger amounts of inventory, okay, to tackle supply uncertainty, and they should also make the plan more flexible so that they can provide buffer against uncertainty in demand. Okay, the inventory strategy, similarly, efficient supply chains, they maintain minimum amounts of inventory to lower cost, whereas for supply chains to be responsive, they have to have high levels of inventory to buffer or to cope with uncertainty in demand and uncertainty in supply. The lead time strategy is basically based upon how long it takes for a particular firm to deliver products to the customers from the time of order. It's called as lead time. So in efficient supply chains, what they try and do is they try and reduce the lead time, okay, but not at the expense of cost. So it is not possible for an efficient supply chain to reduce lead time by increasing cost. They find at the lowest possible cost, how far can we reduce lead time? Okay, whereas in responsive supply chain, their basic objective is to deliver the products as quickly as possible to the customer. So they reduce the lead time very aggressively, even at the expense of increased cost. And the supplier strategy in the case of efficient supply chains, they select suppliers based upon cost primarily and then quality. Okay, whereas in the cases of responsive supply chains, what is important is the supplier's ability to deliver, okay, quickly, their ability to be flexible with quantity requirements, okay, product specification requirements, their ability to have reasonable amounts of quality, and their ability to be reliable. That means they have to continually give or deliver a certain level of performance. So you select suppliers based upon their speed, flexibility, quality, and reliability. Now, one last aspect regarding strategic fit, that is tailoring strategic fit. Now, one supply chain strategy fits all, that particular concept is not always true. Okay, it is effective in achieving strategic fit for a firm that is serving a single market segment. Okay, where the target market has all their target customers have similar needs and they are targeting only a single market segment. For such kinds of supply chains, okay, so sorry, for such kinds of firms which target only a single market segment, then one supply chain strategy fits all will work. That is the case with Ikea. Okay, so this particular one supply chain strategy fits all is not effective in achieving strategic fit when a firm serves more than one customer segment. So when they are dealing with different customer segments with a much more wider variety of products, then one supply chain strategy fits all is not possible. Okay, take for example the case of Zara, which is an apparel retailer. They sell both trendy items. Okay, now the trendy items are products which face high implant uncertainty. Therefore, the supply chain that deals with trendy items, sale of trendy items, they have to be made highly responsive. At the same time, Zara also sells products which are basic items like white t-shirts, okay, where the demand is fairly steady. So therefore, the implant uncertainty faced by the supply chain will be low. Thus, it has to focus more upon being efficient. So this particular company Zara sells both items which are trendy in nature and basic in nature. Therefore, the supply chain has to uh, supply chain has to satisfy two extreme conditions. One where it is highly responsive and one where it is focused upon being highly efficient. So thus, instead of using a one supply chain strategy fits all, we have to use a strategy called a tailored supply chain strategy. Okay, so this basically allows the supply chain to be responsive for trendy items and the supply chain to be efficient for basic items. Okay, that is by uh, proportioning a larger part of the responsiveness requirements to manufacturer. Okay, the trendy items, they are manufactured in Europe where the lead times can be low, okay, even at the expense of higher costs. But for the basic items, okay, where customers require efficiency, item at the lowest possible cost, those items are manufactured in Asia, okay, or Asian countries where the cost is low. So the entire supply chain, okay, for trendy items, it is made responsive by manufacture the trending items in Europe, and efficient for basic items by manufacturing those basic items in Asia. So you cannot have a single supply chain strategy for all the different products sold by a particular company if it serves more than one different customer segment. So that is why we require tailoring strategic fit. So in tailoring strategic fit, that basically helps the company provide the responsiveness for fast growing products, fast growing market segments and channels, while maintaining low cost for mature products and mature market segments. Okay, so for companies dealing with different kinds of products and different kinds of market segments, tailoring strategic fit will provide the company with the required level of responsiveness to tackle both fast growing products and market segments as well as mature products and market segments where the responsiveness requirements are completely different. Okay, and for achieving this particular tailoring strategic fit, it requires sharing operations for some stages or links in the supply chain while having separate operations for other stages or links. Okay, so an example of how uh, to achieve tailored strategic fit, companies share certain stages and have separate operations for other stages is given below. Okay, so an example is the use of same manufacturing line for different products. Okay, so the production facility is shared. Okay, but whereas products which require higher levels of responsiveness, they are shipped using a very fast mode, whereas other products which are required to focus upon being more efficient, they are shipped through slower and less expensive means. So here the shared stage is the manufacturing stage. Okay, a company selling products which require high responsiveness as well as products which has focused to be on more efficient. So to meet this particular two different responsiveness requirements, what the company does is it shares a manufacturing operation where both the products, one requiring high responsiveness, other requiring low responsiveness, they are manufactured on the same line. That means this is a stage of the supply chain where the operations are shared. Okay, and during the transportation, this particular operations are different for different supply chain requirements. So for products requiring high responsiveness, they are shipped using a fast mode. Say for example, air. Okay, air movement through flight cargo. And for shipments which require lower level responsiveness, they are shipped through slower modes like rail or ship. Okay, which are less expensive but at the same time much more slower. So this sharing of operations in some stages is done in order to ensure maximum efficiency while providing appropriate level of responsiveness for each of the target market segments. And this particular concept of tailoring strategic fit is very important for high-tech industries and pharmaceuticals, where innovation is very crucial and products basically move through a life cycle. Okay, take for example the case of pharmaceutical companies. They innovate and find new drugs on a regular fashion, and for new drugs which are new to the market, the product itself generally faces very low amounts of competition. Okay, so since they face very low amounts of competition, to capture the market initially also, since it's a new product, the customers are unaware and the demand for the product will be very low, and the level of uncertainty faced for a new product is also extremely high. Therefore the supply chain has to be tailored towards being more responsive. Okay, but at the same time the same pharmaceutical company may produce another product which has been in the market for 10 to 20 years. Okay, so they are very mature products. They are towards, say, I must say, the latter end of its product life cycle. So such kinds of products, the demands are much more certain. You know what the demand would be like. Okay, and since the products are much more mature, there will be a lot of competitors in the market. So since since you have products which have been in existence in the market for a long time, and since you have a very long list of competitors due to arrival of competitors in the years of its development. Okay, so since we have a large amount of competition, it's very essential that the company changes its competitive strategy. In its earlier stages, it competed upon being more responsive, but while it matures, since new competitors come in, they have to focus their efficiency, they focus their supply chain strategy on becoming more responsive. Okay, and more efficient. So since they want to make it more efficient, they have to change their supply chain strategy as well. So for such companies which deal with products which are new to the market, and also they have products which are mature, that is into the latter stages of its life cycle, such kinds of companies, they require a tailored strategic fit. Okay, so this is the concept of tailoring strategic fit. With this I conclude this lecture. Thank you.